Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Demystifying the IRB Process, a practical guide for early career pharmacy researchers. My name is Jay Barretto. I'm an inpatient pharmacist at Mayo Clinic and currently the vice chair of the Research and Grant Reviewer Committee. I'll be guiding us through this 1-hour session. The institutional review process can feel overwhelming, especially for learners and early career researchers. But today's program is designed to give you practical tools and insights to help make the process more approachable and successful. Before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping notes. Today's webinar will run for 1 hour and is not accredited for continuing education. We encourage your participation during the Q&A portions of the program. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit your questions at any time. We'll address as many as possible during the live Q&A discussion. If you'd like to upvote a question you see, you can do so within the Q&A box. This will help us prioritize the questions most relevant to the group. The chat function is also enabled. We encourage you to use the chat to introduce yourself, share comments, and engage with your fellow attendees. Just keep in mind that the panelists may not see everything posted in the chat, so if you have a specific question for them, please be sure to put it in the Q&A box. Now, here's a look at what we'll be covering today. First, we'll provide an IRB process overview where you'll learn how to form a strong clinical question, understand the key components of an IRB process, evaluate feasibility, timeliness, and ensure patient information is protected. Next, we'll move to a panel Q&A of tips, tricks, and pitfalls, where our experienced panelists will share real-world examples, common submission mistakes, and insider tips for making the IRB process smoother. Finally, we'll wrap up with a discussion on navigating multi-site research, exploring the unique considerations of collaborative projects and the differences in processes across institutions. We are fortunate today to be joined by a fantastic panel of experts. Dr. Christy Kodashaw, a clinical pharmacist specializing in immunotherapy and stem cell transplant at the University of Washington, Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center. Dr. Kodashaw and her PharmD from UCSF in 2021 completed her PGY1, PGY2 oncology residencies at the University of Michigan, and currently serves on HOPA's Research and Grant Reviewer Committee. Andy Price is the Executive Director of Global Medical at Syndax Pharmaceuticals. Andy is an oncology nurse practitioner with extensive experience in clinical research, real-world evidence, and electronic health records. Dr. Sean Griffin, a board-certified oncology pharmacist and associate clinical professor at the University of California, Irvine. Dr. Griffin practices in ambulatory hematopoietic stem cell transplant and cellular therapy, serves as a member of UC Irvine's Biomedical IRB, and is the current vice chair of HOPA's Research and Quality Council. Thank you to each of our panelists for being here and sharing your expertise with us. With that, let's dive right in. I'll turn it over to Dr. Kodashaw to get us started with the IRB process overview.
Hi, everyone. I'll be talking about the key IRB proposal components for the next 10 to 15 minutes. Next slide. All right, so to get started, what exactly is IRB? So it stands for Institutional Review Board. Essentially, this is a federally mandated committee that is ensuring that research is appropriate in terms of human subjects, protecting their rights and their welfare. And the regulatory basis comes from the US Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS, as well as the FDA. Next slide. So what does the IRB do and why do we have to do it? So the IRB really embodies the conceptual aspects of the Belmont Report, which really highlights 3 key principles: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Essentially what that means, though, is they're providing safeguards to ensure that there's objective, unbiased assessments of the risk-benefit ratio of all research that's conducted to ensure it's appropriate, safe for the patients. They also ensure that consents are very, very explicit in terms of really setting reasonable expectations and foreseeable expectations when it comes to the risks and the benefits of partaking in research. They also ensure that ongoing research is compliant. If any adverse events or incidences occur, they must be reported, and if protocol changes occur, they also have to be vetted by the IRB. Next slide. So who is even in IRB? So we talked about this being really an objective committee, And that's why the people that are involved come from different facets of the profession. So you have scientists, non-scientists, and also community public members. The kind of range for IRB reviews can range from a full IRB review, which I don't expect a lot of you to have to require for your residency projects or early career research. Expedited and exempt research reviews are kind of a little bit shorter and truncated, but they still do require to be reviewed by the IRB. The development of which one needs to be done is really based on the risks and the study design and what the implementation is revolving around the patients and the patient aspects being collected. Next slide. So what requires IRB review? The fundamental behind this comes from two main definitions. It must be research, as defined by HHS, and it must be involving human subjects in some capacity. Well, what is research? So essentially the way HHS defines research is a systematic investigation, including research development, testing, evaluation, design to develop or contribute to the generalizable knowledge. And then human subjects really is anything involving a person at any time point, and it could even be just an identifiable private information, i.e. something that is collected or observed by a chart review. Next slide. So what are the steps to really get started with a research project? I think the first step is really to develop a very robust clinical research question. And the first way to do that is to kind of do a literature review to identify gaps in the literature and refine your research question. From my understanding and from residency, usually you're getting a pre-vetted or pre-screened clinical question. However, you really want to make sure it's robust and that it kind of hits all of the facets that you need to ensure that your research protocol is robust. You know everything that you're going to collect. What are your outcomes? So there's a lot of different frameworks you can use to kind of develop and structure an appropriate, robust clinical research question. I personally really like PICO. So it stands for population, intervention, comparison, and outcome. And essentially, you're looking at what population are you evaluating in your research question? What is the intervention you're trying to evaluate? Is there a comparator arm? Are you looking at historical landmarks? And then what is the outcome that you're trying to address? And kind of with that question, if you address all of those elements, you have a pretty good background to kind of hit the ground running. If you already have your outcome figured out and very explicitly defined, you can pretty easily go back and figure out, well, what do I need to collect to ensure that I can appropriately measure or define my outcome? As mentioned in the first step, if you did a good lit review and you are doing a research question that is kind of similar, you can go ahead and look at what exactly they did in the research paper that you're looking at, look at the outcomes, look at what they kind of reported, and that's a really great kind of benchmark for you to kind of use to emulate your structure. Another really, really great resource that I would highly recommend when you're starting kind of developing your research question prior to going to IRB is going to your local IRB website and look at what kind of templates, protocols, and guidelines they provide. Oftentimes they have explicit guidelines as to what is in a protocol that needs to be shared, and then what are the other kind of forms and elements that need to be described robustly. The thing that IRB is really going to be fixating on is what kind of data elements are you collecting if you're doing a chart review, because they want to know what elements of the patient identifiable, i.e. HPI, are you going to be handling, and also what are you going to do with the HPI? How are you going to store this appropriately, meaning don't go to Google Drive or save it on your Word doc on your unencrypted computer. They want you to be explicit in terms of how are you going to appropriately store, encrypt, etc., de-identify your data. All those elements need to be very kind of robustly explained in your protocol, and that's really what IRB is going to be fixating on. Other things to consider when we're talking about structuring and kind of coming up with your research question is the feasibility. For a lot of residents, you usually have a little less than a year to actually perform your entire research question. Collect the data and publish it after you do all your statistical analyses. So you want to make sure that your research question is something that is feasible in your allotted time. So a really great way actually does stem back to that first clinical question. If you have a really interesting clinical question, but the expected sample size is 1,000 patients, and it's only going to be you collecting 20 plus chart review elements, that does not sound very feasible in the span of 1 year. So maybe a great clinical question, but maybe not something feasible for you. Expected patient numbers is also very, very valuable. Like I mentioned, if you don't have a good ballpark just by kind of doing a lit review, your preceptors, RPD are great folks to ask. At my institution, we actually have data analysts that can give us ballpark numbers of de-identified data. So if I tell them, can you give me a list of the patients or a number of the patients who received midodrine, who got CAR T in the past 10 years, they can give me a number. As to whether or not it meets my inclusion exclusion criteria is not there, but it is a kind of good kind of beginning step to know, okay, there were only 20 people who got this in the past 20 years, and I expect that not all 20 meet my inclusion criteria. Is that an appropriate project for me to kind of spend my time on? And then lastly, what are the institutional supports available at your center? So do you have someone that's going to help with stats? Do you have individuals that are helping with the data pull, an analytics team that can really cleanly extract your data so you don't have to chart review all 100 or 200 of your patients? And then how are you going to store your data if you have a red cap available to you? All of those are things that you can look into and really do help kind of expedite the process of conducting research. And IRB also is wanting to know if you are using these elements, since it is involving how are you going to do things. Next slide. So core IRB proposal elements. We kind of hit up a little bit of these, but to kind of be a little bit more explicit. So the research question, like we mentioned, is extremely valuable. Take a lot of time to think about what your research question is going to be, because that really does help you flush out the rest of your proposal. So that'll help you figure out, how am I going to collect my data? What is the data I'm collecting? How do I plan to collect this data? If it's all chart review, if it's a mixture of data extraction and then cleaning up the data via chart review, what are your inclusion exclusion criteria? All of those are really helpful for both you and the IRB to know, how are you going to be finding your patients? Do you have to go through 1,000 chart reviews, which means you're looking at 1,000 patient charts that you might not need to, versus other ways to kind of obtain that data? Risk minimization. So how exactly are you planning to de-identify your data and appropriately, securely store the data? RedCrap is a very, very great utility to do this. There are other elements that you can use to securely store your data. Sometimes OneDrive is appropriate. I would double check with your institution to make sure that these are HIPAA or HPI compliant before you do save these in those kind of drives or clouds, just to be sure. And then if you are conducting research like surveys or things that require consents from patients, do be very explicit about the requirements and all the aspects involving how are you interacting with the patient, et cetera, because IRB wants to know what exactly that consent form is going to look like, and they will vet that consent form. But for the purposes of any retrospective projects, usually consent forms are waived. Next slide. So resources to use before you approach your preceptor or RPD. So we talked about, you're probably getting a pre-screened or you have a clinical question already in mind, but a really great way to kind of delve in deeper is to do a very thorough literature review. So you want to look at, did someone already do this project? What are the elements they collected? What are the expectations with my results and my outcomes? But I think this is also important to make sure that you're not kind of making a redundant project, which IRB isn't going to say this is the same project as the project from UC Irvine, for example. But I think for the sake of going through the process of doing rigorous research, you want to add to the body of literature, right? So you do want to make sure that the question is answering something that other people want to know. So PubMed, UpToDate, Embase, all those are very great tools to kind of figure out, oh, did someone else look at this question, or do they look at it in a different facet that I'm looking at it from a different lens? Again, to really kind of help bring the foundation to what is the gap that you're addressing with your research and kind of how do you move it forward. With regards to the IRB office, like I mentioned, local IRBs are really great resources that I think are underutilized. They're not scary. I oftentimes reach out to them if I have questions, and they can really help provide submission checklists, sample protocols, or if you're uncertain about certain aspects of, if you think this is exempt versus expedited, you can ask for clarification if you're not certain based on the forms with your local IRB. Next slide. So practical tips for your IRB submission. So we mentioned research question needs to be really robust. And with that, having a very clear, explicit, detailed protocol is really, really important, especially when it comes to addressing the regulatory requirements, which is really the foundation of what IRB is trying to do. Addressing Data privacy and management. Again, be extremely explicit about data security and how you're handling PHI. How are you de-identifying the data when you're doing your analyses, and if you decide to publish your data or present as an abstract or a poster. And then again, if you do have consent forms, you want to be very explicit about the consent form process. And lastly, again, IRB staff are very great tools. If you can get ahead of issues, you can ask them things ahead of time prior to your submission so they don't kind of slow the roll when they have questions in the middle of your review, because that does slow down the process. Next slide. So a few key takeaways here. Again, hopefully after talking for the past 10 to 15 minutes here, the IRB process sounds a little bit less scary. They really are not trying to hinder your research or prevent you from doing your data collection or get your patient list, but their role is really around protecting human subjects. And for that reason, they want to make sure that all research that is being conducted is ethical and compliant. Preparing early, reaching out with questions early to both your preceptors after you've done kind of rigorous review of your research question and the literature, as well as the local IRB elements that are available to you, are really helpful. And one other thing that I will say is, if you have, past examples of colleagues who have submitted IRB proposals, especially revolving around the language of the data safety elements, I think it's a very reasonable thing to look at the verbiage. I'm not saying do not copy from your colleagues, but you can use it as a framework and a reference to what was the language revolving around how we securely handled the HPI, and going forward, how will you emulate that in your kind of proposal? Because that does tend to help. Next slide. All right. Thanks, guys.
Now we can move on and let's open it up for panel discussion. Bringing everyone in. Christy, thank you for providing all of that great information, starting a research project. What, I guess, regularly available resources do you highly recommend that should be utilized before approaching a preceptor or residency program director if, an early career pharmacist or a learner is interested in starting a research project?
Yeah, so we kind of talked about a really good literature review. I also think that, kind of going back to the research question, if you are coming up with a question by yourself and you're kind of trying to hit a clinical nuance, meaning my institution does this practice this way, but it's not heavily data or driven, that's a really great thing to kind of look into. So you can look at the kind of similarities or commonalities with that area that you're trying to address in the literature and say, oh, so we don't bridge with heparin, we bridge with this for these patients. Why? How? So really doing a good literature review can be really, really helpful. You don't have to have all the answers, but I think having that background really, really sets you up for success. So if you saw there's a phase 3 from 2009 in similar patients, but doing a little bit differently things, it's really, really helpful for you to have known that going into your discussion with your RPD or your mentors, because they're probably going to be like, oh, well, what's available in the literature, especially when it comes to kind of those initial foundations of developing the research question. And then I, again, kind of will say, if you are not certain what to do in terms of what elements are required in the proposal, IRB should be pretty clear about what they want. And if not, I think they're usually very happy to help or provide a list of, you need a study protocol. The study protocol must outline X, Y, and Z criteria. And then from there, you can kind of hit the ground running.
Sounds great. Thank you. Um, Moving on to at least understanding a little bit more about IRB determinations. Andy, what are some examples of projects that might be considered IRB exempt? And what is the difference between IRB determining that your project meets exempt status versus requiring an expedited review?
Absolutely. It's really good to understand as you're formulating that question, what is going to help you answer the question. And as Christy said, really making sure you know the population or the intervention that you might want to study is going to help drive what that decision is. So, talking about the exempt review first, if the answer to your question lies within data that isn't really tied to sensitive information, or you couldn't specifically identify a patient, it's probably going to be exempt review. But the other thing to keep in the back of your mind is that it's actually not up to you or your director or the PI, it's up to the IRB. They will make the determination for you and give you a path forward. So think of things around maybe a quality project. Maybe you want to know, is something in your team affecting your organization or affecting the care of the patient? That may fall into a quality umbrella, and that's certainly exempt. The other thing that comes to mind are surveys that don't talk about sensitive information or that don't really address a vulnerable population. Oftentimes, those projects are also in the exempt bucket. If you start to cross over into something that's a bit more sensitive or poses minimal risk, because again, getting back to what Christy said, the whole point of the IRB is to protect patients and their information. If there's any risk that could be involved in how you look at an intervention or how you're trying to answer a question, they may say that it's expedited review. Expedited review may not necessarily lengthen your study or provide a barrier. It just says that you need to keep the IRB updated at a pretty infrequent basis. Very different than clinical intervention studies. That's where people say full board or a full IRB review. That involves continuous update of an IRB. So really kind of keep in the back of your head, what are you trying to answer? What might you come across in your path to answering that question that could provide any risks to a patient and their data?
Yeah, and I think, Andy, that's a great point, especially when it comes to designing your study. If you're not going to use that data element that pushes it from, say, into that expedited category, so from exempt into expedited, then maybe don't collect that or include that and remain in the easiest category for the purposes of your study.
And I think Christy really touched on that nicely as well when she said, be specific in your application about what you're going to look at. You don't need to involve broad fields if it could, again, push you into another category.
Yeah, I agree. Safety is at the forefront of the IRB submission and their processes. So with that in mind, um, Sean, what are some of the key processes and procedures researchers should utilize and obviously include in their IRB submission to determine that the proper safeguards are in place to prevent unauthorized access to sensitive data?
Yeah, and I think there are sort of two ways that I approach it. Christy certainly highlighted the data storage piece in terms of exactly where you're going to keep and where you're going to store your research data. Most institutions have preferences. Christy might not say to copy your colleagues, but I might advocate more strongly for copying your colleagues. I know for my particular site, the preference is really that data is stored in RedCap or a similar device. And once you start talking about storing it in other places, they prefer, say, the cloud over storing on your local desktop computer or anything along that standpoint. So I think certainly having a hopefully previously vetted but also equally robust plan to protect the PHI that you're collecting as part of your study is incredibly important. But I think the other part of your question that you're sort of getting at there is related to you as the researcher only accessing the minimal amount of information that you need to conduct your study. Because I think many of us, in particular, depending on your institution, you may use your same electronic medical record access in order to chart review or data collect. And I think you have to be very, very careful in terms of exactly how you're approaching that. And I think that's when it's certainly best practices to sort of get the minimal data that you need and sort of the minimal pieces. Don't go off on a tangent about reading, say, the psych note or XYZ note because you're just clinically curious. And I think along those same lines is also the importance of using, we call it enterprise analytics or data analytics, or if there is a team at your institution comprised of honest brokers that can pull the data for you and provide you with just your data points. That's also potentially another safeguard to make sure that you, as the researcher or another member of your team, isn't inadvertently accessing information beyond the scope of their protocol as well.
Yes, I understand REDCap has incredible functionality to even determine user group access individualized, so you can even tailor what your researchers can see and do within that REDCap space as you're collecting data. Um, when we think about sensitive data, patient charts, um, can anyone from the group share an example of your own experience where working with a vulnerable population may have presented unique challenges during IRV review, and how you navigated successfully, gaining IRB's acceptance to your protocol, including that vulnerable patient population that you're going to study?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this to at least kick us off, and feel free to chime in if anyone has other examples. But where I've seen this really come up is in the AYA population. So those youth who are maybe providing information about their experience as a patient, but maybe they're 16 or 17 years old. How do we have, really protect the information that they might share while they are a minor? And really that comes down to the consent process. And we talked about retrospective chart reviews may have a consent waiver. However, if you're wanting to collect survey data and that patient is a minor, you really need to be specific about what that consent process will look like. Are they taking their survey in a private room? How is their parent informed? How is the patient informed about who will see the answers to their questions? And then sometimes there's even a parent survey alongside of a patient survey, and sharing with the IRB, obviously, but everyone involved in the consent process, how those questions and answers are handled is very important. When you're looking at charges as a sensitive population as well, don't surprise yourself. Really formulate how are you going to find that information, and building on what Sean said before, use your resources within your institution and data governance to say, this is the population I need to look at. How do I best look at them? Because getting the return on your query, because you do have a lot of access in your EHR, is not the time to be surprised that you found out a patient's HIV status or pregnancy status inadvertently, or a patient who is too old or too young to meet the criteria to answer your question.
Thank you for all of that information. I think in line with a question that appeared in the Q&A, one last question for the group during this section and segment. Can you think back to a submission that was rejected, or delayed, or required revisions? What did you learn from that experience, and how did you adjust your approach towards future submissions? Um, can you think, of a resource that's going through this revision rejection process towards approval that you might have underutilized at your institution?
I can get us kicked off. I think certainly I remember back to my first protocol that I submitted at this particular institution. And I think one of the most frustrating things for researchers, even though I understand the reasons for them, is the institution to institution variability, especially when it comes to the exempt and the expedited particular categories. And I went through and I said I was collecting MRNs because that was needed to identify my patient population. But then further down in the section related to HIPAA, I didn't check that I was collecting MRNs. So it was immediately sort of sent back to me and said, how can you say you're collecting it up here, but not down here? And I think I would say, at least in my experience, the number one reason that exempt or expedited review is delayed is back and forth with the researchers, more so related to the technical components of answering the questions the way that they were intended to be answered. And that's where I think it comes back to Christy's point. To me, especially as a new researcher, reach out to your IRB staff. They will literally, if you want, they will probably walk you through your first submission. Like I know we're now all comfortable with Zoom and sharing screens, but back pre-COVID, I just walked into the office of one of the IRB staff members and I'm like, I just need help on how to submit this correctly. Like, this is everything I want to do. How do I submit it correctly? And then once you learn how to do it correctly, it's just replicating that process time in and time again. I don't know if that's my approach. I saw Christy sort of nodding along. I don't know if there's another resource that you use, Christy.
No, I think that's spot on. I kind of had a similar hiccup when I first started here because the Hutch and UW are two separate entities, but they share electronic medical records, and it's extremely confusing. I think I emailed IRB, maybe, I kid you not, like back and forth 10 times because the attending I was doing the project with just gave me an example protocol, and she's like, here you go. And it's like, I don't know what a lot of this is. So IRB was really helpful because we had listed we're chart reviewing from X, Y, and Z. But then IRB was like, well, what is this? What is that data that you're trying to collect? Like, what's that database? And I was like, I don't know what that database is. Like, do you know what that database is? So really helpful to kind of, again, like, I really like using examples. So after that, I asked around and was able to get my hands on like a copy of a recently accepted chart review project that a colleague was doing. So I was like, what exactly are you guys using and how are you using it? Because it was very helpful to figure out, oh, like this was an antiquated database that's been extinct for over 10 years, which is why IRB was like, what is that? Which kind of created some issues when we initially submitted because they were like, what exactly is that database? What are you trying to do with it? So that was a recent hiccup, but was really, really useful and interesting since I've never worked at an institution that has two shared entities and they each have their own IRB, which makes it even more confusing.
Yeah, I think anytime that there's data shared across the organizations that are particularly complex, and I think that's just more common that there's more than one IRB or more than one center's data going into the EHR. That's where I've personally run into issues where the IRB questioned a certain hospital's patients being involved in our report, had not even thought about that. And it actually posed bigger questions to the institution to say, oh, are there other projects going on like this? So again, the mentorship up front, your data experts within your institution can be an invaluable resource right up front.
Yeah, and Andy, that's something that I've struggled with. And to be honest, I haven't got a good answer from the IRB. So my institution utilizes Epic, and many of our patients agree to have all of their Epic data from other institutions also shared in
Yep.
the electronic medical record. But technically, that's outside records.
Yep,
And for the purposes of research, you should really only be accessing your institution's own data. But it's like it's right there, and depending on how it's incorporated, you
Mhm.
might not even quickly be able to realize that it's
Exactly.
truly external data.
Yep. That's a really, really good point. I would even say within an institution, some health systems have a problem defining whose patient is it, right? How many times they're seen at one hospital versus another, and they're just generally being passed back and forth within the same health system. That also gets really dicey.
Well, thank you all for providing the detail and recall of these experiences. I think, this question and the discussion about multi-site um, in a health system or in different institution leads right into. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Griffin for the third portion of this webinar.
Perfect. So, building off of some of our discussion, I'm hoping that I can share with you perhaps some best tips, or at least my understanding for how to go about considering multi-center or multi-site retrospective research. And everything I'm going to go through, I promise you, I learned the hard way. I either made a mistake or I hit a roadblock, and hopefully my now 7 year in understanding can help some of you not hit all of those roadblocks from the beginning. Next slide, please. So I think it's important. We've talked a lot about PHI, but certainly within HIPAA, research data is also included within that the regulation associated to that. And specifically within that, there's a section called the privacy rule, and there is specific mention related to research data. And what's particularly important is this applies sort of, if you think about HIPAA in general, more so to the act of sharing data and transmitting data for the purposes of routine clinical care, but it does also apply to research purposes. So this adds another layer if you're trying to now do sort of a multi-center research where you're combining data from multiple institutions for a single analysis. Next slide, please. And this is where data use agreements come into play. The HIPAA legislation actually calls out specifically the need for data use agreements. And some of the clearest language in the regulation is related to the disclosure of limited data sets from an outside institution or party, which I think is often most applicable to multi-center retrospective research because that's really at the heart of the type of data that you're sharing. And I think it's clear from a HIPAA standpoint that limited data sets are still protected health information. And in particular, you still have to adhere to the different components of the privacy rule and of HIPAA. And this includes obtaining a data use agreement in order to share data. Next slide, please. For a limited data set, so I think normally we're all familiar with what a de-identified data set is. But when it comes to a limited data set, you have to keep in mind that there are certain identifiers that are still included there. So certainly you strip some of the most common identifiers, but I think for a limited data set, one of the most often identifiers that you want to keep is dates, for example, like dates of diagnoses, dates of treatment, and things along those lines. But if you are sharing that, you're really sharing a limited data set and not a de-identified data set. And along those lines, you have to make sure that you have the particular approvals in place to share that limited data set for research purposes as well. Next slide, please. When it comes to the data use agreement, there are several components that need to be included. I think for our purposes, the biggest caveat is your institution is going to have a template DUA. Please reach out to the appropriate individual and utilize your institution's template. You don't need to go about creating your own DUA from scratch for the purposes of a retrospective multi-center trial. But there are certain components ranging from sort of the permitted uses and disclosures of the limited data set, identifying who may use or receive the information. You can see recipient prohibiting the use of the recipient from further disclosing it beyond the context of the DUA that you have in place, requiring the recipient to report back to the original institution if it becomes aware of any accidental disclosure, prohibiting the recipient from identifying the information or contacting the individuals if they were able to identify the particular individuals included in the limited data set, requiring recipients to ensure that any agents to whom it discloses the information will agree to sort of the same restrictions as provided in the agreement. And we'll talk about that. But to me, that comes depending on the type of DUA that you have in place. I think there are sort of two different ways to think about it. One potential way is a two-way DUA, so data will be shared back and forth between sites. Or what I found is much simpler, and people are often more happy with, is a one-way DUA. Like say you were doing a multi-center trial with 20 different other sites, and your site was serving as sort of the main site, all of the data would flow to your site, and you won't necessarily share the full data set back with all of the individual sites. Additionally, also depending on the context, sometimes you may be part of like a sort of cluster within a bigger group. So you might be working with all of the University of California sites to put your data together to then send off to a larger sort of single site for a multi-center research project. So certainly keeping in mind the intricacies related to that. I think for me, the biggest thing is understanding that when in doubt, a DUA is required, and it's a key component that must be in place prior to sharing any information with another site. And there is also most institutions will have sort of different levels of review required based on the type of entities involved in the data use agreement. For example, if you're sharing data with another or nonprofit or government-owned academic medical center, that often requires a lower level of review than if I was sharing data with a pharmaceutical company, for example. So certainly all things to keep in mind. But to reiterate, ask your DUA specialist at your institution to provide you with a template and then just fill out that template accordingly. Next slide, please. So even if you have a data use agreement, that doesn't mean you're necessarily 100% all set to go ahead and share the data. Often, many organizations, more so through the Compliance and Privacy Office as opposed to now the Research Office, often have a committee or group of individuals that are responsible for the health data governance of the institution. This group is mainly responsible for keeping track of and making sure that data is sort of not inadvertently disclosed outside of very specific parameters. So I think of them more as not necessarily related to the research process, but like the actual keepers of the health data for my institution and being in charge of everything related to that. So many organizations do require an additional level of review where they often want to see the data use agreement and the IRB approval in order to give their final stamp of approval. Next slide, please. And I thought you probably thought I was done, but nope, there is still at least my institution and many other institutions, is I actually, when sharing data, I have to get a cybersecurity risk assessment if I'm sharing the data electronically. So for example, I did a multi-center trial with the University of Michigan, and we were using the REDCap at the University of Michigan to store our data. But my institution needed to do a review of the security of Michigan's REDCap tool in order to sign off so that they could be confident that their health data, when stored in Michigan's REDCap, was still compliant with sufficient standards and sort of protocols in place. So keep that in mind that your institution might have additional requirements that are similar to that. Next slide, please. But I think in general, and I'm hoping to provide sort of an example to go through this, but in general, I think it's important to figure out what steps are required at your particular institution. And unfortunately, again, this is incredibly frustrating. They are going to be slightly different at every single institution across the country. But this sort of five-step example is for a recent retrospective multi-center resident research project that I helped one of my PGY2s on last year. So we wanted to look at real-world outcomes related to Hispanic and non-Hispanic patients receiving the new or novel bispecific T-cell engagers. So we identified that we wanted UC Irvine to do this project, but our sample at UCI, because these agents were so new and we don't have thousands of myeloma patients diagnosed each year, would be too small to have a meaningful conclusion if we were to do it alone. So we knew if we wanted to get after this research question, we would have to involve other sites. Next slide. So in this first step, we went through the process of identifying collaborators. Now, for the purposes of the feasibility of a resident research project, I actually did this before the resident even started to sort of get things as, as much in place as I could to help. But ultimately, we identified 3 other centers that wanted to collaborate with us on this project. And as you might imagine, even just getting your colleagues to agree did take amount of time. So that took us about 2 months before we had this group of individuals that wanted to participate and wanted their PGY2 residents to also participate. Next slide, please. IRB approval was actually, in the grand scheme of things, a relatively straightforward piece. I think sort of my advice is for retrospective multi-center research, especially those that are not funded, it's often easier for each individual entity that's involved to get their own IRB approval. When you start going down the path of a central IRB or a single IRB serving as the IRB for the other institutions, you're adding another layer of complexity that's not necessarily required. So my recommendation, especially for this type of research, is that each center get its own local IRB, starting typically with the main center or the coordinating site. Now, during this in the IRB, I mentioned that this is a multi-center trial, so I did get a message with my IRB approval that, hey, just so you know, a DUA would be required for you to successfully complete this project. And then they gave me links to the DUA specialists within the Office of Research. Next slide, please. And this was by far the longest process, is getting the data use agreements signed and executed. Our first struggle was just finding who is your DUA specialist for your institution. I think if you don't necessarily work on the academic side, like you're not an employee of the college, on the med center side, finding who is that person, either at your institution or at the university, who can enter into the DUA agreements is often half of the battle. But once you found that, each individual site will have their own template language, and they'll want to argue back and forth over whose template language to use in certain sections. And lawyers get involved and they go back and forth. And it ultimately gets resolved because this happens all the time, but it does take time. And also, I think it's important that depending on your institution, some institutions require an IRB approval prior to executing a DUA. Not all institutions do that. Some will allow you to enter into a DUA and then get the IRB approval whenever it goes. But I think regardless of the institution, they do allow you to go through both steps concurrently. So that might be one thing to consider, but it might be dependent on one or the other before you're able to execute both of them. So next step, please. And then this is where I found out about the health data governance approval. This was a whole other ordeal, mostly because I didn't know it existed, but I got alerted from the DUA individual that, hey, have you gone through this data health governance approval? Once I found the right person, it was relatively straightforward. I just had to submit a copy of my DUA and a copy of my IRB. And they had a different committee review it, asked me a couple of questions, and ultimately approved it. But then once they approved it, they told me that I also needed a cybersecurity analysis. Thankfully, in this case, it wasn't required because all the data was coming to UCI. So it was immediately waived after I pointed out that fact. But on a different project, when we were sending data to different institutions, that was another hurdle to get in mind. Thankfully, this happened sort of concurrently to the DUA execution process, so it didn't necessarily hold us up. Next slide, please. Finally, in March, so nearly a year later, we were able to share the data. We did utilize UC Irvine's REDCap, but we did learn a word of caution. Each individual institution has different things that are required for an individual to become an affiliated user of their REDCap, and UC Irvine's is one of the absolute worst. They require the submission of date of births and social security numbers and attendance to a 90-minute live class. I've worked with the University of California, San Francisco, even within the same University of California system, and all I had to do was provide very limited personal information and then check a box that I would review this PDF of information, and they granted me affiliate access. So certainly keep in mind, if that's the approach that you're going to take, that you need to grant affiliates access to your REDCap. There might be additional requirements in place for that. Next slide. Some tips for success. I think always assume it's going to take twice as long as planned. Identify the correct people at your institution early, or ask colleagues who the right people are. And then share best tips and an overview of the process with anyone who will listen to you at your institution, especially if they're considering doing similar research. And then maybe, just maybe, if it can still help you with your research project, consider a de-identified data set and not a limited data set, and you might save yourself from most of this hassle, but certainly something to keep in mind. I think in general, multi-center research is absolutely possible, and I strongly encourage pharmacists, especially if they think their own institution doesn't have the numbers to have a meaningful conclusion or outcome or analysis, to reach out to your colleagues and get involved in multi-center research. Next slide.
Thank you for all of that information and applying your own personalized touch to the steps to show everybody how to navigate an undoubtedly complex process. We can have in the last few minutes here, I'll open and continue to read the Q&A that's available. We can start with, I guess, a question that relates to the most recent presentation, and how do you stay organized when conducting or participating in multi-site studies?
I don't know. I struggle. I think just trying to share all the documents in a single folder, and depending on exactly what's included in the documents, potentially using a like OneDrive or a SharePoint to have the other individuals involved just directly upload their documents. I know certainly something as simple as keeping everyone's IRB approval uh, in one place can be a struggle, but I have faith. Pharmacists, we're type A's, we're a little bit OCD when it comes to organization, so I think you'll be fine. But unfortunately, it's just coming up with a system and continuing to utilize it.
We have folders, subfolders, document dates and timestamps, and extreme levels of detail for all of it, maybe even a spreadsheet with checkboxes, undoubtedly. Another question that has come through to open to the panel is, how has your approach to IRB submissions changed as you've gained more research experience?
I think one of the things that was kind of coming through my head listening to Sean present is just to keep moving. If you look at his timestamps of when colleagues were brought on board versus new information was being uncovered, right? He needed this data use agreement, different IRBs, not a central IRB. You just have to keep moving. And I think one thing I've learned is to not put the project down. I think I put a lot of projects down early on because I was a bit intimidated, to be quite honest, that I didn't understand what I was doing, and I was actually very afraid to make a mistake, that I would pull a piece of data that I wasn't supposed to have, or that I was somehow going to get in trouble, or do something with the patient's information that I wasn't supposed to do. And so I think right out of school, I had a lot of great ideas that I just didn't move forward with because I didn't think it was worth the time. And it wasn't until I really got involved into helping with projects that I realized kind of coming alongside someone gave me confidence to move forward. So I think just to keep getting the next question answered, finding the right person, move on to the next question, and just to really keep moving because, taking better care of patients only happens as we collect more information and help each other be better clinicians. And so it is worth it to just keep moving.
I'll just add one piece. I think whatever Andy said was great. Completely agree. You can get discouraged really quick, especially when the IRB process starts taking longer or they start having questions and things get delayed. Maybe your initial deadline, say you wanted to submit to this, like ASH, but now you missed the ASH deadline. There's other conferences, there's other things. So unless like it's an explicit requirement, say for like your residency and like you need this to graduate and there is contingencies to certain elements, you can keep going. Some projects take longer and, maybe it took 3 years instead of 1, but you can still keep going and you don't have to give up even if it takes longer or there is kind of barriers. So completely agree. Don't give up if you think it's a question worth pursuing because I'm certain other people feel the same way.
Thank you all for that. We can move to a question in the chat and we'll stick with the multi-center studies for this one. What strategy have you utilized to navigate authorship, which goes a little bit beyond the IRB process, but is still obviously a distinct part of the research process?
I'm quite passionate about this, so I'll take first stab and then the other panelists can get in. So I fundamentally believe that you need a clear agreement at the very start. I think in general, it's safe to assume that the primary site or the one initiating the project is going to be either first or senior author or some combination of the two positions if there's multiple individuals who are leading it. But when it comes to the other sites, the coordinating sites, I've seen two approaches. One approach was based on the number of patients that particular site contributed to the overall study, and it was just listed in order. Like if you gave 1,000 and the other center gave 990, the 1,000 center would go first in the order and the 990 would go second. I've also seen just purely alphabetical in the middle. So certainly those who had a key role would be one of the first authors, but if they were indistinguishable other than the patient numbers, is just keep it simple and just go alphabetical. But I do think regardless of the approach that you take, that you make it clear, i.e. write it down and get everyone to agree to it in the very beginning.
Does anybody else have anything to add in the last kind of 2 minutes that we have available? One more question quickly, knowing that we only have the limited time, is what is your favorite piece of IRB advice you received early in your research career?
This is so simple and Christy gave it, but talk to the IRB. They will talk, they really actually want to help. And I think once I get over that, it was much easier.
And I think mine would be the IRB exists to protect participants in research trials. That is their main goal, and that is their overarching sort of thought process and perspective for everything that they do. And I think having that understanding also helps how you communicate with the IRB as well.
Echo everything that's been said. Get your hands on a recently approved one so you can emulate the verbiage. Maybe not word for word, but darn close for the data safety elements.
All of that is valuable information. And with the little time we have left, I'd just like to say thank you so much to our panelists, Dr. Kudashaw, Andy Price, and Dr. Griffin, for sharing your time, your experiences, all of the practical advice you gave to us today. Thanks to everyone for joining the session and engaging through your questions, chat contributions. We hope today's discussion helped you to demystify the IRB process and gave you a couple strategies to approach your own research projects with a little more confidence. If you'd like to revisit any of the information, a recording of this webinar was made and it will be made available in the next couple of weeks and communicated out to the members. On behalf of HOPA, thank you again for being here, and we look forward to seeing you at future programs.